Psychology says most people don't lose friends suddenly. They lose them quietly, long before anyone notices. Psychology suggests that walking away from old friendships is rarely sudden, cruel, or emotionally detached. People almost never erase shared years on a whim. More often, the distance forms after a long stretch of quiet reflection and internal evaluation. Over time, the mind begins to sense a subtle misalignment, even when nothing outwardly seems wrong. Conversations sound familiar, yet feel disconnected from the person you are becoming. The bond remains, but it no longer matches your inner reality. Psychology explains that emotional safety depends on harmony between identity and environment. When that harmony weakens, discomfort appears well before any conscious choice is made. Ending old friendships is usually the conclusion of this process, not its beginning. It is rarely driven by anger, betrayal, or dramatic fallout. More often, it comes from recognizing that the relationship belongs to a version of yourself that no longer exists. Externally, the process looks calm, but internally, it can take years to unfold. By the time distance becomes visible, the emotional decision has already happened. At some point, identity expands beyond the social circle. Psychology shows that personal growth and relationships do not evolve at the same pace. As people mature, their values, boundaries, and self-perception slowly shift. What once felt natural can begin to feel slightly misaligned without any clear conflict. Many old friendships reflect earlier versions of the self that have quietly faded. Versions shaped by survival, uncertainty, or emotional limitation. Staying connected can feel like being gently pulled back into a role you outgrew. Not because your friends are harmful, but because they remember who you used to be. Psychology explains that the mind seeks alignment to preserve inner stability. When relationships reflect an outdated identity, tension builds beneath awareness. You may feel unseen, misunderstood, or subtly confined without knowing why. Creating distance becomes a way to protect identity coherence, not to erase shared history. It is not a rejection of the past, but an acknowledgement of personal evolution. Separation forms when growth moves faster than the relationships surrounding it. Sometimes, letting go is the only way forward without internal fragmentation. Second, emotional effort quietly becomes uneven. Psychology shows that most relationships end without a single dramatic moment. They fade because emotional work becomes unbalanced over time. One person consistently listens, supports, adapts, and explains. The other remains largely unchanged, unaware, or emotionally inaccessible. At first, the imbalance feels tolerable and easy to justify. You tell yourself this is loyalty or patience. But psychology shows that emotional labor accumulates silently in the nervous system. Each unreturned effort adds weight, even without resentment. Eventually, the brain stops registering the relationship as connection and begins registering it as cost. Time together starts to feel draining instead of nourishing. Distance, then, brings an unexpected sense of relief. Not relief from the person, but relief from the constant emotional effort. Ending contact becomes less about conflict and more about self-protection. And the absence of the relationship feels lighter than its presence ever did. Third, silence appears before the cutoff. One of the clearest psychological signals before distance is silence. Not loud silence, but the quiet disappearance of explanation. People slowly stop defending themselves or correcting misunderstandings. They stop asking to be seen, understood, or emotionally met. Psychology describes this as emotional withdrawal, not indifference. When someone feels repeatedly unseen, the mind begins conserving energy. Explaining yourself starts to feel pointless and emotionally costly. Each attempt to clarify only deepens the sense of being invisible. so the mind disengages long before the relationship officially ends. Conversation may continue on the surface, but emotional presence fades underneath. By the time distance occurs, communication has already collapsed internally. Cutting off friends often happens after silence has done its work. It is not an impulsive act, but the final expression of long-term disengagement. What appears as coldness from the outside is often exhaustion within. Silence becomes the bridge between connection and departure. Fourth, outgrowing the role you were given. Psychology shows that many friendships assign fixed emotional roles: the funny one, the quiet one, the reckless one, the weak one. These identities form unconsciously and remain unchanged for years. They help groups function, but they also restrict growth. When someone evolves beyond that role, subtle resistance often appears. Not intentionally, but rooted in familiarity and comfort. Psychology explains that change threatens group stability more than conflict does. When others expect you to stay the same, growth can feel suffocating. You may sense confusion, disappointment, or quiet resistance as you change. The cutoff is rarely about disliking friends or rejecting shared memories. It is about refusing to remain confined to an outdated version of yourself. Staying in that role begins to feel emotionally constricting. Distance becomes the only way to exist freely without explanation. Letting go becomes an act of psychological self-respect. Fifth, accepting that closure is not always a conversation. One of the hardest psychological realizations is that closure is not always mutual. Not every ending can be talked into understanding. Some people will never truly see you, no matter how carefully you explain. Psychology shows that repeated explanation without insight leads to emotional fatigue. Eventually, the mind stops seeking validation through dialogue. Silence becomes a boundary, not avoidance. Emotionally mature individuals recognize when conversation no longer creates clarity. They accept that understanding cannot be forced. Distance, then, becomes the most honest form of closure available. Not because empathy is lacking, but because inner stability matters. Letting go without explanation is not cruelty. It is an acknowledgement of emotional limits. Sometimes the healthiest response is to step back without asking to be understood. And the absence of words protects more than continued conversation ever could. Cutting off old friends does not mean someone is cold or ungrateful. Psychology shows it often means choosing coherence over emotional chaos. Not every connection is meant to last forever. Some are meant to shape you, then quietly release you. The healthiest minds know when holding on costs more than letting go, and walking away becomes an act of alignment, not abandonment.